I'm joining you all, as many of us here are, from beautiful Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Garigu country in Canberra, and I'm privileged to live and work here and in the surrounding regions where the boxgum grassy woodlands are, of course, situated. I'd also like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to acknowledge country all around this continent where everyone here is dialing in from. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm the knowledge broker for the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting. We've got a fantastic lineup coming up. We've got quite a few people in this meeting today, and please do feel free to pop questions in the chat, and we'll have sort of times and breaks in between our presentations for questions and plenty of time at the end as well for questions and answers. Before we get started on our main presentations, I'd like to invite everybody to please pop your own introductions into the chat so that we can hear from you about what organisation you're from and also what traditional owner country you're dialing in from today. So please do introduce yourselves, and that way our presenters know who's in the audience, our audience know who else is in the audience, and you can have that awareness of who's around. So I'm aware that we have obviously people from the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. We also have people from New South Wales Government and Local Land Services, and people from ACT Government, I believe, will be dialing in as well. So please do let us know where you're from. It's really, really helpful. I usually ask this and many people don't respond, but I'd really love you to pop that information in the chat for all of us so that we have a good idea. That way we all get to know who's here and make those connections as well. So this is of course about the research that's been done in various woodlands projects in the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. It's also about all of you, the people who'll be using this research. So we have our presenters presenting here today. I do want to encourage you to please ask those questions and make those comments, and we definitely want to hear from you about what's useful to you in all of this work. So we'll have plenty of time for interaction and conversation down the track. I'm just going to talk a little bit by way of introduction about who's going to be speaking today and what we're going to be hearing about. So the broad focus of this is on woodlands. It's on the projects that have taken place through the hub and related work in the boxgum grassy woodlands. It's about woodland birds, and it's about various specific species related projects also that have happened in the context of the woodlands. It's and also of course about threats to woodland birds. In particular, you'll be hearing about noisy miners later on. So we have presentations from David Lindenmayer, Martine Marin, Jessica Walsh, Michelle Gibson. So Martine, Jessica and Michelle will be focusing on the woodland birds work. David will start by giving us an overview of the woodlands, and then we'll hear about some specific projects that have been undertaken on the Yass daisy and the pink-tailed worm lizard before opening up to discussions at the end. So without further ado, and thank you to those of you who have responded to me requesting those introductions, please keep them coming so that we can hear and see who's here and welcome everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David Lindenmayer now to kick us off with an introduction to the boxgum grassy woodlands.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for everyone for being online. What I wanted to do was to give a very brief overview of some of the woodland projects that are either within NESP or a related project in the Sustainable Farms Initiative at the Fenner School. So it's just some background to these ecosystems, as most people would probably already know. You could have once walked from Melbourne to Brisbane through almost continuous temperate eucalypt woodland, and many of those ecosystems have been extensively changed and fragmented. In fact, the woodlands are amongst the most altered ecosystems, large-scale ecosystems anywhere on the planet. So as part of our work, which dates back to the late 1990s, we have a series of large-scale long-term projects. The ones with arrows are all live projects or are still working, except the top one, ANU no longer does the monitoring for the Environmental Stewardship Program. But all the other projects are still live. And as part of those projects, we've really looked at a whole series of different kinds of what we call natural assets on farms, ranging from tree plantings and remnants right through to individual paddock trees. And by and large, one of the most important ways to think about these different kinds of woodland is a structural formation. So ranging from old growth, two kinds of natural regrowth and coppice regrowth through to plantings. And as part of this long-term work across a very large number of sites and a large part of this woodland environment, we've collected extensive biodiversity data on a range of groups, but also different attributes to the vegetation cover and structure. And so I'll just give a little bit of a taste of some of the results from some of the projects, very much a subset of what's happening. For example, one of the issues that's we're often asked about by landowners in particular is what's the relationship between plantings and grazing impacts. And so what we've seen is that since the 20 to 30 years that it's elapsed since the Natural Heritage Trust, many of the plantings that were established now have fences that are deteriorating quite quickly. And so that allows us to look at the effects of grazed versus ungrazed plantings. And what we see is that as the plantings age, there is definitely a deterioration in the fences, or in some cases they're actually even removed. And a path analysis shows that the grazing regimes alter the leaf litter cover and also the mid-story cover. And that leads in turn to quite strong negative impacts both on birds and on reptiles. And here's the herendogram that goes with that, with the different paths that link, for example, bird species richness to the grazing regime to the amount of litter, and the changes in understory cover and mid-story cover. Another advantage of looking at sites for prolonged periods of time is that the work spans many climate events or drought events. And so it's possible to link together the changes in bird assemblages with changes in climate and weather over time. And in our case, we've also got a gradient of annual rainfall across this area because it's so large. And we also have a gradient across the life history attributes of birds from very small ones to very large ones. And so essentially we're able to look at the different structural types along the top against rainfall, against body mass. And essentially what we see there is that the small birds are the ones that are very strongly associated with plantings, especially birds of conservation concern. And that plantings turn out to be drought refuges during those really prolonged periods of dry weather. And in fact, the positive effects of plantings are largely seen during droughts and not so much during the wetter periods. And there's a paper that comes from this that I'm happy to send to people if they're interested in following that up. We also see that there's a key threatening process, and I know that Martine and her group will talk about this more in a few minutes. The noisy miner is a native honeyeater. It's relatively large and it's hyper aggressive, and it's listed as a key threatening process. And what the long-term data show are that plantings with an understory have relatively few miners. And where there's an understory intervention in old growth woodland to bring the understory back in, after about 8 years, the number of noisy miners starts to decline. And here are two results showing that: the relationship between acacia in the mid-story and the probability of detection, and the years since enhancement in old growth woodlands and the probability of detection of the noisy miner, which declines over time. Now, the other thing that's important here is that the noisy miner does not act alone. It's part of an axis of evil. And that axis of evil includes not only the noisy miner, but the two butcherbirds, the pied butcherbird and the grey butcherbird. Both of those butcherbird species have relatively benign effects on the rest of the bird assemblage when in isolation. But when they occur with the noisy miner, there's a strong signal of synergistic effects amongst the three species. And the combined effects of those three species have the strongest effects on the smallest birds. But importantly, when the mid-story cover is restored or levels are already high, then those synergistic effects are significantly reduced. So here we have two of the culprits as part of the axis of evil. And here's the paper describing that axis of evil that was led by Martin Westgate and published earlier this year. Some of the work that was led by Donna Belder, and other work complementary to that by Richard Richard Beggs, has looked at bird breeding success in woodland remnants. And most of these studies that Donna in particular looked at in her initial review showed that almost all of the work on birds is based on occurrence, but it's not based on demography, such as bird breeding success. But what Donna was able to show was that, for example, plantings are not ecological traps in which birds enter and then invariably don't reproduce. And so they're also not population sinks. So even these relatively small plantings and small remnants can be valuable bird breeding habitat. And what Donna also found was that some species of birds are foraging across quite widely spaced plantings and moving quite long distances. So one of several really nice papers that Donna led is this one in Biological Conservation, and another one in Ecological Applications. So now we move very quickly across to another set of studies to do with nest boxes. One was putting out nest boxes in remnants and plantings and determining whether those two kinds of sites were connected or not. And the second one is a rather sad study looking at nest boxes and an offset for the Hume Highway and when that was widened. So this is the first study about remnants and plantings that were and weren't connected, where nest boxes were put out as part of community projects in different areas of woodland. And so what we see with this work in particular are two species that do really well out of this. One is the introduced honeybee and another one is the introduced European starling. And so what we see from the work in nest boxes to date is that we are essentially reinforcing populations of already common species, such as the brush-tailed possum and the ring-tailed possum. The nest boxes tend to do better in connected versus isolated patches, which tells us a bit about the kinds of species that are moving across the landscape. Plantings tend to do better for nest box use compared to old-growth woodlands, and that's because the latter generally have more hollows so that there are more options for animals to nest in. So the key issue from that initial part of the work was that you really do need to have tailored design boxes, because if you don't, you end up with lots of things that you don't want. You have a perverse outcome for hollow users, particularly bees and starlings. And this is really reinforced by this study that was published in 2017 with Martine and others in the two groups at University of Queensland at ANU. And this was looking at the offset associated with the widening of the Hume Highway. So as part of creating this extensive road transport corridor and widening the system to be dual carriageway, over 500 nest boxes were put up in an attempt to compensate for the removal of literally hundreds of large old paddock trees. And what we see in this case is that some of the species for which the nest box offset was targeted, such as the brown tree creeper and the sugar glider, if you look along those lines of numbers, you see that you have almost no occupancy by those target species. So this work really was a sad saga. It was quite poorly designed. We ended up with lots of pest species, starlings and bees, and black rats. When we did have occupancy by native species, they were almost invariably the common things. Then we had almost no threatened species. And rather sadly, almost all of the boxes were very badly attached and essentially collapsed onto the ground within a year or so. So really the moral of the story here is you need to think very deeply about what a proper offset really is, because the nest boxes that were installed were really not a true offset. So just in conclusion, we've still got a lot of work to do. We're thinking a lot and working a lot on the different kinds of natural assets on farms, ranging from farm dams and shelter belts right through to paddock trees and native pastures. And there's a lot of allied work also now going on soils and soil productivity, state and transition models, particularly in terms of how you assess condition. And early next year, we'll have a new book out thinking about natural assets and how that intersects with farming practices. So I'm going to leave it there. There are my contact details. I'm always around on email and more than happy to chat to people or send people papers from the work that's been published to date.
So we might move on now to our woodland birds, and we can come back to further questions for David later. So first up, we have, well, the whole woodland birds team. Martine is going to kick us off. Over to you, Martine.
Thanks, Rachel. And Jess is going to drive for us. So she's just going to bring up the slides, hopefully any moment now. Thanks so much, Jess. Now, apart from, hi, I'm Martine Marin, and one of the reasons I'm not driving is because I'm pretty rubbish at technology. But the other reason is that the lion's share of this presentation is actually going to be presented by Jess Walsh there at Monash, and also Michelle Gibson, who's actually technically at Melbourne Uni now, but hasn't been able to get down there from UQ. And Jess and Michelle are two of the leaders of the broader project that we're going to talk about today around woodland birds. But there are many, many others behind the scenes, and I will also be sneakily presenting some slides from Courtney Melton, who couldn't join us today, who's working on the noisy miner stuff, so that'll come last in the series. So before before we launch in, I just wanted to say a few sort of preliminary words about this entity we're talking about. When we talk about woodland birds, it's a term that we throw around. We sort of, well, we do. We know exactly what we mean when we say woodland birds, pretty much, with some variation that can sometimes be important. But, this is a group of species that people who work in woodlands are pretty familiar with, and they know really pretty well when you're talking about a version or an instance of this community that is really healthy and is doing all the things it should be doing in the ecosystem, versus a version that is really degraded and in trouble. So Jess, do you want to go to the next slide and start to show the sort of image of the different sort of species, or the different sort of functional and taxonomic roles that species have in woodlands in Australia? So even though you can't see which species these are, you know which groups of species they are, and you know what they do. You've got ground foraging, granivores, and insectivores. You've got tree creeping species. You've got lots of little insectivores in the understory, and then through the canopy you've also got a lot of small and large nectar feeders that also feed a lot on insects. You've got carnivores, from the big raptorial species right through to those other villains that David mentioned, the butcher birds, and the parrots, of course. So there's actually a really standard profile of a functioning community here. And if this particular co-occurrence of functional and taxonomic sort of similar that we could recognise from place to place was made up of plants, we'd probably have it described and named as a plant community. But we don't really think about that. We don't really think about ecological communities as in the way that as being primarily comprised of fauna. But there's not really any reason why not. And especially when you have something that has such a predictable sort of set of species co-occurring together within a whole range of different plant communities as the woodland bird community. So next slide. And of course, the reason that we are worried, that we are interested in being able to describe these things is because we also need to be able to identify what the entity is so that we know when we should start to be worried. And we know that we should be probably a bit worried about anything that relies on the existence of woodlands, because we have so many pervasive threats to woodlands. Most woodlands have been cleared completely. They're just gone, and they're continuing to be cleared, especially up here in Queensland where I'm based, and increasingly in New South Wales. Sad to say, increasingly. You would think it should be the opposite. And also, of course, there are so many degrading processes that go on within the remaining woodlands. And, David highlighted several of those. But, cattle grazing, changed fire regimes, weed invasion. There are so many things that fundamentally simplify the structure and change the structure of the habitat available for that assemblage, and it results in a degraded assemblage. So next slide. So a few years ago, we sort of tried to corral as many woodland bird ecologists as we could into one room to say, okay, we are aware that there is this entity called that you would call loosely a woodland bird community. We know where it sort of occurs. We know it seems to be in trouble. How do we go about formalising that knowledge in the way you would need to if you were going to formally describe it as an ecological community and then assess whether it's in fact meets the criteria as a threatened ecological community? And so this work was done to really identify whether people all really did have a similar mental picture of what a woodland bird community was, how it varied from region to region. So in the top figure there, you can sort of see the different subregions that were identified. Each of these subregions still had a really similar taxonomic and functional profile of birds, but the individual species differed, you know, from east to west, for example. So there are a lot of similarities. And then we, having described this with this group of woodland bird ecologists, we were then able to say, okay, well, given that we all agree on this, we've sort of agreed on the definition of what it is. How is it doing? Does it look like it might be threatened? Now, part of that answer to that question is, as I said, just to look at, well, how much woodland have we destroyed? How much potential habitat do they even have left? And that picture is pretty damning. Next slide. But the problem is that it's even within those woodlands that there's ongoing decline occurring that you may not see because we're not really directly tracking it. We often think about tracking individual species and how they're doing, but tracking entire assemblages of birds together is something that, you know, there's really only been sort of recent work to pull together really effective ways of doing that, particularly in terms of tracking this particular community that we're concerned about. And this paper by Hannah Fraser really sort of brought together different lines of evidence to suggest that this assemblage was in fact in trouble. Next slide. So these graphs, without worrying about the detail, the point is the darker components of the bars are the proportions that are of the original extent of this community that are in good and pristine condition. And as you go left to right in each of these graphs for the different subregions, as you go left to right, you're basically going through time. So from our estimate of what probably was the distribution of condition scores, you know, pre-colonisation, through to recent data points. The three most recent data points are based on BirdLife Australia standardised survey data. So you can see the picture is not good. These assemblages are in steep decline. I think the decline case is really clear and it's really alarming. And so that raises the obvious question, what should we be doing about it? It's easy to list a lot of things that sound like they should work and help, but we need to know, when do they work? How much do they work? How much of them do we need to do? And for that, we need evidence. So next slide may well be the first slide of Jess's talk, where she is in fact going to tell us the answer to that question. Go for it, Jess.
Thanks very much, Martine. So yeah, as Martine just mentioned, the woodland bird community is in decline, and we need to know exactly which actions are effective at managing these species and the overall community. So there's been many efforts around Australia to conserve these woodland birds. As David mentioned, a huge array of interventions at the national level, going down to local interventions, for example, tree planting. And so other examples include protecting remnant vegetation, controlling noisy miners, managing fire, controlling grazing, so reduction of grazing or grazing exclusion, and tree planting. And so there's a huge array of evidence out there and research out there about woodland birds, about their decline, and as David mentioned, several studies about the effectiveness of management actions. And it's really important to know whether these actions are effective to make sure that we are having positive outcomes for the woodland bird species. Yet, so there's a lot of information out there, but there isn't a synthesis for that. And so the aim of this research was to conduct a systematic review to evaluate the effectiveness of the conservation management actions for woodland birds in Australia. A systematic review is where we try and compile a comprehensive overview of all the scientific literature, both published and unpublished. And so we started off with over 5,000 papers that we eventually whittled down to 141 papers that were relevant in that they tested management actions for woodland birds. So of these 141 papers, they were looking at 26 different actions. So some of these actions were trying to improve the habitat extent and configuration, so through land protection or revegetation, natural regeneration. There were lots of interventions trying to improve the habitat quality through fire management, grazing exclusion, like adding or retaining coarse woody debris in the landscape. And then there were interventions focusing on the species interactions, for example, noisy miner control and predator control. And then there were 36 studies that were looking at the combinations of these actions. So overall, there's a lot of interventions that we have information on that test the effectiveness of these actions. And as I said, 36 studies looked at the combinations of actions. If we look at the interventions that had the most evidence, we find that replanting vegetation, managing grazing, supporting natural regeneration, managing for fire, and controlling noisy miners, adding and retaining woody debris, and protecting designated areas or designated sites had the most number of studies that tested those interventions. Whereas you can see many of these interventions only had 1 or 2 papers that we could use or that we found that looked at the effectiveness. And surprisingly, controlling feral predators and installing nest boxes, we really could only find a few papers. That I suppose I should say to determine whether the papers we could include or not, we had very specific criteria. And so there's a lot of papers out there that talk about these things, but we were looking specifically at like whether they had tested the effect of these interventions. And actually, there were several interventions that we found no evidence for at all, based on the criteria that we used. So we didn't find any evidence or any papers looking at feral herbivore control, so goats or deer, and neither did we find evidence on translocations, supplementary feeding or captive breeding. So this is the overview of all the relevant studies that we found. It's quite a lot, but this information doesn't tell us whether these interventions are effective or not. So that's the second part of the study that we did. So we had to take these studies and extract information about whether these interventions were effective. And so this is where we tried to summarize the findings of all the different studies. To do this, we had, again, really specific criteria to be able to identify the actual effect of an intervention. And so we needed to have, the studies needed to have used control sites to be able to actually measure the difference between a site where the intervention hadn't have happened compared to a site where the intervention had happened. So, for example, tree planting, the studies had to be comparing it with, say, a paddock where the tree plantings hadn't occurred, as opposed to, say, a remnant woodland where you'd expect to have a good condition, like a good woodland bird community condition. And we were also constrained by the statistics that were reported in the papers, so we could only use studies that were looking at that reported statistics and also the direction of the trend. So did the study find that it was a positive effect, a negative effect, or no difference? So we could given this criteria, we could only include 25% of the papers, so a quarter of the papers. So that resulted in 37 studies that tested the effectiveness of 16 interventions. And most of these studies come from, say, a lot of the studies from David Lindenmeyer's group, but also across the rest of the woodland bird distribution. So what did we find? So we could only use look at studies that tested both, or like either the species richness or the abundance, so the total number of individuals that were recorded, and say for grazing exclusion and grazing reduction, we found really mixed results. So we found that some studies had a positive effect, some studies had a negative effect, and then some studies found no change between the control and the intervention sites. For prescribed burning, again, there was quite a lot of evidence. Well, not a lot of evidence. The most evidence that we could find, relatively compared to other interventions. But for prescribed burning, we actually found that either there was no change or there was a negative response to woodland bird communities, both the species richness and abundance. For controlling noisy miners, there was either no change, though a few studies did find positive results. So again, results are mixed. Some of the other interventions, so protecting sites or natural regeneration, again, mixed results. And then the two interventions that we found some evidence for, so adding or retaining woody debris and also replanting vegetation, there were only 1 or 2 studies that we could actually use, given the criteria that we had. But these 2 interventions had consistent results. So we found positive, of the studies that we could include, they found positive effects. So overall, given the amount of evidence that we thought we'd find, the information that we could actually use is quite surprisingly thin. So what does all this mean? We still don't really know which interventions are most effective, and it's really hard to make broad generalizations given the available evidence for the interventions. So particularly for the interventions where we had several studies that we could use, so fire, grazing, noisy miner, and site protection, we had really mixed results. And obviously these could be due to many reasons. So the time since the intervention, the area or the method, it could be the different ecological contexts, but it also could be that there's other threats that are impacting these woodland birds. So that's why you don't find any effect. We did find some consistent positive effects for some interventions, so tree planting and leaving large woody debris. But as I said, this came from a really small number of studies. So overall, even though there is a lot of research out there about woodland birds, we're really limited in how much we could use for our quantitative analysis. And also, we were only including 2 specific metrics, species richness and abundance. And as David said, this is really, you're missing out a lot of other information about the condition of the species and the community if you're only looking at those 2 metrics. So there's an urgent need to evaluate many management actions for woodland birds. And in particular, we should be focusing on the ones that are common actions but have little evidence, particularly things about like herbivore control and predator control, and also ones where we have some evidence but it's inconsistent. So we need to tease apart where grazing, fire management and noisy miner control are effective and where they aren't. So in summary, our work has enabled us to collate all the studies that are relevant and then provide a synthesis of which ones are effective or not. We haven't been able to find that, but it at least provides a baseline for in the future as we strengthen our body of evidence. And so hopefully this database that it's going to be like online, and that we'll have a fact sheet that we can distribute. It's in the process of being created at the moment, but ideally this information can then be used to help inform interventions and decisions, but it's really essential that the evidence base is grown, and we really need more rigorous, well-designed studies and monitoring to increase our knowledge about the effectiveness of management actions. And this can take place in parallel with the research and future implementation in adaptive management frameworks. So I'd just like to thank all the review team for their hours of collating all the information, to our collaborators who've been really key in helping us with this project. And yeah, if you're interested, I'm very welcome to email me or take questions at the end after Michelle talks. So I think that was a really big overview of the existing literature. But now Michelle will be talking about a case study. So looking at how we can be using data that already exists to help inform management actions specifically for grazing and tree planting. So over to you, Michelle. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jess. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, so as Jess just said, I'm going to be talking about one way that we can try to address this gap in knowledge on the effectiveness of management interventions, and we focused on grazing exclusion and replanting. Yep. And I'd just like to acknowledge a couple people who aren't here that were part of this project: Jeremy Simmons from the University of Queensland, and Nikki Tawes from Greening Australia. Yep. So as I said, we focus on grazing exclusion and replanting. They're two fairly widely used actions in woodlands to try to mitigate the impacts of the clearing that's happened within the woodlands. Next slide. And so we were interested to know whether these actions actually benefit the woodland bird community and over time. Next slide. So the citizen science data set that we worked with was from Nikki Tawes and Greening Australia in collaboration with the Canberra Ornithologists Group. You can hit the next. And so Nikki trained up volunteers to go out twice per year over a 20-year period. And these volunteers did surveys using the 2-hectare, 20-minute standardized method. And this was mostly done on private lands. So it's a really, really amazing data set that we were able to work with. And we had 134 survey sites scattered across Southeast Australia, and they fell into one of 3 different treatment types. So we chose sites that were control sites that had grazing as usual. We had grazing exclusion sites, and then sites with both grazing exclusion and replanting. Yep, next slide. And so we used mixed effect models to test management action effectiveness for against 3 different community metrics. So species richness, total abundance, and the community condition metric, which Martine and Jess mentioned previously. But just to go into a bit more detail here, this metric was based on hundreds of bird survey hours and also expert knowledge, and incorporates both the number of bird species and the proportion of small-bodied birds at a survey. Yep. And so this ranges from 0 to 1. So a pristine woodland bird community would have a score of 1, and a low quality community would score 0. Yep. And so what we found that species richness, you can hit the next one, at control sites with grazing as usual showed no significant change over time. grazing exclusion showed the same, no significant change over time. But sites with grazing exclusion plus replanting showed a significant positive change in species richness over time. And then for abundance, we found also control sites again showed no significant change in abundance over time. Sites with grazing exclusion only showed a slight positive change in abundance over time. And then sites with grazing exclusion plus replanting showed the strongest effect, and that was a significant positive change in abundance over time. And then finally, for the community condition metric, we found at control sites, again, we found no significant change over time. Same with grazing exclusion alone, no significant change over time. And then again, grazing exclusion plus replanting showed a significant positive change over time. And that kind of ties in with what David mentioned earlier about small birds doing well in replantings, because that metric, small birds, is a critical component of the community condition metric. Yep, next slide. So in summary, what we found was that grazing exclusion plus replanting offered the most benefit for woodland bird community, and these benefits increased as plantings aged. We also found that grazing exclusion alone didn't seem to offer much benefit over time relative to the control sites that had grazing as usual. And this indicates that active restoration using replanting might be required to reestablish native vegetation and birds at these sites. And finally, just that citizen science data sets can offer a valuable resource that can help us to understand the effectiveness of conservation actions, even if the study design is not perfect. So yep, that's all for me. And thanks for your time. And you can contact me at that email address if you have any questions.
Thanks, Michelle. Martine again here. I'll click my camera on and I'll pick up for the last of the woodland bird stories before we can hopefully launch into a bit of a Q&A session around this. And I see Laura's already popped a question in there for later, Jess. So I am pretending to be Courtney Melton, who's doing a PhD at UQ at the moment. And I'm probably not going to do a very good job of being Courtney, but I'll do my very best. Courtney's been doing some awesome work looking at something that's come up again and again in the last few talks, which is about the structural complexity, basically understory density of vegetation and how important that turns out to be for woodland birds. And one of the things she's looking at as part of her PhD is how we can manage one of the threats that tends to go along with a depleted understory, and that is noisy miners. So next slide. We've already met this species, so I don't need to say too much about it, except that despite being a native species, it is listed as a key threatening process under the EPBC Act, as well as in New South Wales and in Victoria. And it's just as problematic in Queensland and in parts of South Australia and Tasmania as well. Queensland doesn't have a key threatening process listing option. It's a bird that just really likes all the things that we've done to transform landscapes. And so open landscapes, landscapes with lots of edges between forest or woodland and open agricultural areas, and woodlands, even way away from edges, as long as they've got a simplified vegetation structure. All of that sort of thing, which of course has become much more common in Australian environments over the years, makes for great habitat for noisy miners and their families, because they live in really big groups. They have a very sophisticated social structure, and they're also sedentary, which is interesting because a lot of our honey eaters do a lot of moving around, you know, and they're quite dependent on where nectar is. Noisy miners aren't. They need to find a place where they can get carbohydrate resources year round. And so that's not going to be nectar usually. Sometimes it'll be nectar, but other times it'll actually be lerp from psyllid insects, the sugary secretion. And so when they find a place, they stay there and they defend it because they need to monopolize that resource. So they're extremely aggressive and they chase anything away, even stuff that doesn't look for a second like it's going to want to take any of their lerp. Their strategy is just to be indiscriminate. Next slide. The next slide just shows a quick visual, I suppose, of what these sorts of landscapes tend to look like. You know, the similar sorts of vegetation types here, but, you know, degraded, simplified structure in the bottom examples compared to a denser version, sometimes with weeds. So some of those things you can see as lantana, but that can actually be sort of effective in reducing noisy miner domination of these systems, which is another story. Next. So what do we do about it? You know, it's a really, really widespread problem. This is a species that occurs right across Eastern Australia. And I should comment that we really need to understand this not just for this species, but because of its congeners. So bell miners and yellow-throated miners also cause problems for other birds. Yellow-throated miners, we don't even know all that much about the nature of the problem besides the other thing they do, which is to interbreed with endangered black-throated miners. And again, that's another story, but all of them are aggressive, basically. So what do we do about them? In the case of noisy miners, well, the sort of obvious response is, well, if it likes the transformation of the landscape, we've got to restore the landscape. But it's not that easy to go back. You know, most of those landscapes that you fly over, if back in the days when you used to fly over them from Melbourne to Brisbane or Sydney, you know, they're being used. We can't just put them all back to trees. Some we can, but it's going to be a limited sort of a solution. You know, there's places where we can do it, there's places where we can't. Similarly, replanting, you know, understory within remaining woodland, again, something that we can do in some areas, not in other areas. It's also quite slow and expensive, so it's quite an intensive sort of a thing to do. So something that's probably not possible everywhere, and in some places not desirable either. They may not be ecosystems that naturally would have a really dense understory, and yet they may be areas of woodland that are sort of all that's left for woodland birds to inhabit, but they're being excluded from it. So there's a lot of complexities there. So it's not an ideal solution in every situation, but it would be great if we could do it in more places. But we need more sort of arrows in our quiver, I suppose. What about targeting directly the threatening process, the noisy miners? Can we remove them? And so there have been a couple of different approaches to this tried in the past. Translocation, catching the birds, moving them somewhere else, is not a very good one for a couple of reasons. It's not very effective. They tend to they come back. But also, you know, these things, if you watch them, are incredibly aggressive, especially against other individuals of their own species. So you introduce an individual that isn't a member of the coterie, the little family group, and it will probably get beaten up pretty badly and maybe to death. So it's actually not, because it's not very effective and it's actually causes a lot of suffering for the birds, translocation is generally not a great idea. So it sort of leaves us with lethal control in a humane way. And of course, as soon as you start talking about culling native species, that becomes a pretty contentious issue. Culling any sort of a species can be contentious, but especially when you're talking about a native species and a native species within its original range. And so it sort of is, if we are going to look at this as an option, we really need to do a couple of things. We need to be reasonably confident that it's going to have a beneficial effect. It's sort of like when I moved up here to Queensland, and there are a lot of cane toads out here on the block, and I initially just started, you know, killing them because that's what you do, right? With cane toads, they're a pest, until it occurred to me that it's utterly pointless. It's making no difference, and all I'm doing is, you know, injuring animals for no good reason. So that stopped, and it's the same sort of thing. You wouldn't go and do it if it wasn't actually going to work. You just wouldn't. The thing is that we've seen it work sometimes, and not other times. And you hear a lot of anecdotal stories about this. So it's actually not really clear if it's going to work. So there's been really highly variable results. So we need to clarify this. We need to be sure, first of all, that we can actually do it, that we can remove them, that we can do it in a humane way. And then we need to be sure that by doing that, we're actually going to have the effect we want. Not just that noisy miner numbers go down, we actually don't care about that, but that small bird numbers, the ones that are most persecuted by noisy miners, that they recover. And some studies have seen that. So on the next slide, I think there's just a few examples of some of the studies that have done removals of noisy miners. So the original work was done by Marilyn Gray and Mike Clark and Richard Loyne out of La Trobe University back in the 90s. And they actually recorded quite from a relatively low intensity removal, a very long-standing reduction in noisy miners at those sites, at those little patches in Victoria, and a recovery of the small woodland birds. So, you know, it seemed we have some examples where this seems to work with really limited effort, which is different to when we're trying to intensively restore a site. You know, even without the habitat restoration, small birds came back. Next. But there's been plenty of, and so yeah, there was follow-up work, and then so this one by Stephen Debus is a really great example of a description of an intervention that a landholder took at a site and just observed that it was effective. And there's a lot of these cases, but they're sort of unofficial, and because these are native species, there's often, you know, a question mark about, you know, exactly whether it's a permitted action to cull these birds. And so we don't have access to all the data that we need, because a lot of it is just inside the heads of individuals who've done interventions. Next slide. Yeah, and so then, you know, we thought maybe if we scaled it up, if we just did really big removals, that might be clearer about whether it's effective. And this was some work that was led by Galen Davitt with Richard Major and Kim Morte and Paul McDonald out of Armidale. And this was a huge removal. Thousands of noisy miners were removed from a series of sites, and they just came back. They just came straight back. Next. I forgot how many were on here. We might click through a few. Yeah, so there's been this really awesome work in areas that are habitat for really threatened species like region honeyeaters, and controlling noisy miners in areas there. So having some benefit for a particular threatened species. So the problem is we've got this mix of different findings, and I think that, I don't know, is the next one Richard Beggs' work? Yeah, okay. So then the work that David was alluding to earlier, which was led by Richard Beggs, which did another series of pretty intensive removals across a whole suite of sites. And again, the noisy miners just came back. Incredible numbers of these birds must be in these landscapes. So huge mixed bag. Next slide. So what Courtney's aim was to go out there and try to bring all of this together, get all of those data sets, enter data sharing agreements with all the authors of these past studies that have been published, but also put the call out to landholders under an ethics permit to interview them about sort of unofficial trials that they may have done. So to try to put together a database that has all the information we can have, which I think is only fair. If we're talking about lethal control of these birds, then we should put the data we've got from every instance of that to work to try to answer the question of when it's likely to be an effective intervention and when it's not. Next. So obviously these are all different data sets. There's only so many things that we could actually measure and have standard measurements of. So we looked at a whole lot of different factors that might affect the outcome of a cull. So things like the landscape context, whether there were shrubs in the site or not, how big an area was treated, how many repeat culls at the site and how long apart they were, how many noisy miners per hectare were removed, and also how many there were to start with. And the response variables that we could pull out that we could do right across the whole large data set were, did they at least halve noisy miner density? And did they result in an increase in small bird abundance and species richness? And so these were thought to be changes that were likely to be able to be detected and reported on by the landholders who did this in a less sort of, they didn't do formal surveys as well. So we could sort of do a combined analysis. We also did an analysis just of the subset of studies where we had more data, but the results were similar. So next slide. Very briefly, the results were not that helpful. We did not find the silver bullet answer to what made a noisy miner cull effective. The only thing that was there was that sites that had been that there'd been quite a long duration between the first and the second cull was slightly more likely to reduce noisy miner density after those two culls than culls that had been done in short succession. But nothing else showed up. You know, it's very frustrating because I think we all had sort of inklings about what might be effective, but the data just didn't suggest any patterns. Next. What about small birds? Did anything affect the chance that small birds increased regardless of whether noisy minor density reduced? Not really. Again, across the board, whether it was abundance or species richness. So the data have sort of left us feeling like we know even less than we perhaps thought we knew before. Next slide. Because essentially there were a lot of failures in the data set. So a lot of cases where a lot of noisy minors were removed and noisy minors came back. So their density just wasn't really reduced very much. Sometimes going back again, as I say, sometime later, seemed to then have a knockdown effect that lasted a bit. So there were just not many cases where noisy minors were reduced to the level you think they ought to be reduced to be effective to allow woodland burns to recover. But the really weird thing about all this is that across the board, in almost every case, there was an increase in small bird richness and abundance, even though based on how well the threat, noisy minor density, was controlled, you would expect, well, that wasn't enough to expect a response from small birds. But there was a response from small birds. So that's a really, really interesting thing. So it really seems to be something about the disruption of the noisy miners' social structure that has an effect separate to simply their pure density. Okay, next slide, because I can see I'm going too long. So to wrap up, you know, I think we really do need to justify when we're doing lethal control. And unfortunately, we still don't really understand. We don't know enough about what the circumstances are under which we can prescribe broadly noisy minor control, direct control. It seems, though, that there are still benefits emerging even when it appears not to be that effective. And so that reveals, as I say, that it's probably the disruption of structure that's effective in those cases. So it's not numbers. We don't see it in nature that you can have coexistence of so many noisy minors and small birds. It's only after these culls that happens. So also they seem to still work in quite targeted cases. So when you need immediate relief for a particular threatened species, perhaps targeted removals can be recommended even at this stage on the evidence. And obviously for an lasting effect, it seems likely that pairing these controls, this type of control with restoration is ideal. I know researchers always say it, but really in this case, more research is required. I really had hoped that we might have a really clear direction on this by now, but it's clear that we need to do more. And it would be great to coordinate the collation, the ongoing collation, to add to our existing database from future removal events so we can try to learn more about this. Thanks very much. Feel free to contact me or Courtney. I think our details are on the next slide, and I'll hand over to Rachel.
All right, well, I'm going to change direction slightly and talk about a couple of sort of more specific projects and studies that we've had running the last couple of years. The first one is on the endangered Yass daisy. So I guess we've got a pretty reasonable understanding of revegetating and restoring habitats with shrubs and tree species like eucalypts, but our understanding of forb species and grasses and particularly threatened species is a little less well known. So we set about setting up a study specifically looking at trying to restore the Yass daisy in boxgum woodlands under different livestock grazing regimes. So we set this study up on 10 farms, loosely in the sort of Cowra, Young, Burrawa districts. And we were looking at 3 basic livestock grazing treatments. So we had 2 degrees of controls. So we had set stock farms, we had 5 of those, and then we had rotational grazing farms, and we had 5 of those, and we set up and planted out Yass daisy in sites at each of those farms. And then we also had a total livestock grazing exclusion site and a spring and summer exclusion site in each of those farms. And then we were also looking at treatment of exposure. So we replicated that in both sunny and shaded sites at all of those sites. With Greening Australia's fantastic help, they propagated all of the Yass daisy for us and had that ready to go and plant out at our sites in winter 2019. Unfortunately for us and most of the sort of southeast temperate woodlands, we'd sort of had 3 years of pretty severe drought. So certainly not a good time to be undertaking a planting study, but the plants had been propagated for us, and they sort of basically had to go in the ground. So we planted them out during winter and early spring in 2019, and they were planted out in these little 1 by 1 metre plots at our sites. With the drought, we were concerned about getting them established, so it turned into a large-scale sort of gardening project to try and keep them alive and maximise our survivability. So we wound up subsequently going back and fencing off all of these sites because we were concerned about both livestock and also kangaroo and rabbit herbivory with the lack of feed around right through that sort of spring and summer period of the 1920 period. So we set up these fences, fenced them off, and then watered them over that spring and summer period. And it wasn't until spring last year that we actually, after we'd done our first round of monitoring, that we pulled those fences down and opened them up to that grazing, that paddock level grazing. So unfortunately, our results are fairly limited at this stage, but ongoing. They've only been, plantings have only been monitored in the spring of 2020. And as I alluded to before, that grazing treatment, at that paddock scale or site level grazing treatment has not actually been applied to those sites until spring 2020 when we removed the fences down. So we checked them all in spring last year, and given the horrendous conditions up until autumn last year, we were actually very stoked that we got approximately 55% survival rate on our plants, and a lot of them went to flower and set seed, which is pretty exciting. But as I said before, there's no grazing level treatment at that stage. We've subsequently pulled the fences down, and I was out checking the first of them the day before New South Wales lockdown started only a few weeks ago, and early signs of re-emergence from the dormancy over the summer and winter period this year. So the plan is to get back out there this spring, COVID permitting. Like most people, we're sort of under lockdown, and field work is on standby at this stage. But we're pretty hopeful. Last year was a sensational spring, and we've had above average rainfall in the last 12 months. And we've actually been picking up the Ash Daisy wild populations on sites that we've been monitoring for 10 years now and never detected them until last year in wild populations, and popping up on roadsides where we'd never seen them. So they're pretty tough little things, it would seem, and a lot tougher than I certainly gave them credit for. So we're hopeful that the ones that we've planted have established and have got a pretty good chance of sort of continuing. And our plan is to, now that we've removed those fences, undertake that ongoing monitoring over the next couple of years, and then start to analyse that grazing effect. So that's sort of where we're up to on that one. And the other specific study, which I'll touch on a component of it and then pass over to Jackie O'Sullivan, our PhD student, was the pink-tailed worm lizard, or the Aprasia parapulcella, which is a threatened species of legless lizard. And it's got a fairly wide predicted distribution, but not that many cases of known locations. So we set about doing some very targeted surveys to try and find some new sites and populations, largely across the southwest slopes bioregion. So we were sort of searching from Cowra down to Albury and everywhere in between, doing some fairly targeted stuff based on likely habitat. And we managed to detect at least 15 new sites. There's more in there depending on how you define sites, but 15 new sites that were completely unknown prior to this study, which is pretty exciting. Again, this is a study that was sort of hampered by drought, and our capture rates and detection rates were very low compared to previous years. We've got a bunch of really high quality reference sites that we always use to sort of check at the start of the season to make sure that it's time to start looking for them. And even in those really high quality sites, we were getting very limited numbers last year, and 19 and 2018 as well. Hopefully we, after the sort of 18 months of good rainfall and sort of food and prey available for these guys, we should hopefully start to see a bit of a bounce back with the populations this year, we're hoping. So out of those samples, out of those sites rather, we took as many genetic samples as possible. Can't always capture these guys. They're pretty cryptic little things that hide out under rocks for a very limited time period, generally from late winter through till mid to late spring, depending on the season. They'll be thermoregulating under small rocks sitting on the surface of the soil in paddocks, and they'll be thermoregulating under there. But as soon as it gets too hot, they start to go back underground. And because of the drought and the sort of the dry soil conditions and presumably the lack of food for them and the ground heating up very quickly, a lot of our survey seasons the last couple of years turned off very quickly. So we didn't get as many as we'd hoped, but despite that, we still managed to get nearly 200 tissue samples that got sent off to DartSeek for genetic sampling for SNP analysis, and that's recently come back. And looking at all of our stuff that we've put through, very preliminary results so far, it's looking like we've got 6 genetically distinct groups that are associated with that geographic distribution across our study area, which is sort of from that sort of north of Cowra down to the border down near the Albury region. So this is a graph of our individual genetic samples here. So some of them are very clearly pulling out into quite distinct groups, but there's a bit more complicated at some of our other sites. So the next step for us is to do some detailed analysis on that genetic data and really sink our teeth into that, and then use that as a means to inform some further targeted surveys to pick up more sites and get more tissue samples, and then start to build up a better idea of the species distribution across the landscape and hopefully fill in some more distribution holes across the whole region. And we're working in collaboration with the University of Canberra, so Stephen Saar's group, as well as Don Driscoll's group at Deakin, to start looking at the genetics across the entire range. So using some samples from Steve's group within the ACT, they've got a lot of genetic samples that we're hoping to be able to chuck in the mix, and likewise with the Deakin guys, working with them to look at the Victorian populations and start to fill in some of those voids and hopefully inform some of the distribution and then some of the management implications from that as time goes on. So that's a very sort of quick rundown of our the genetics component, and there's another component which was a rock addition study, which Jackie O'Sullivan, our PhD student, has been leading. So I might pass over to her to discuss that, and then we can answer questions at the end of both of our sessions, I think. And my contact details are there if anybody wants to get in touch.
Okay, beautiful. All right, so hello everyone. I will be talking about project 1.2.16, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's about enhancing critical habitat for the pink-tailed worm lizard in agricultural landscapes. So I'm sure you're wondering by now, what is bushrock? Well, bushrock is loose and fragile rock that sits either on rock or soil surfaces, and often occurs in large open areas near more complex rock outcrops, as pictured in some of those photos there. Bushrocks can provide critical habitat for a diverse range of plants, invertebrates, reptiles, and small mammals. And in particular, bushrocks are recognised as a key habitat for reptiles and are often a common feature in agricultural landscapes that can support a diversity of reptile species, including threatened species such as the pink-tailed worm lizard, striped legless lizard, little whip snake, and grassland earless dragon. Now, the broad-scale removal of bushrocks from the landscape is listed as a key threatening process under the 2016 New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act. However, despite this recognition, rock clearing is still permitted for approved quarrying activities, existing developments, or as part of routine agricultural activities. In particular, bushrock in grazing and cropping paddocks can reduce the efficiency of agricultural practices and damage expensive equipment, and advanced machinery has therefore been developed that can effectively crush and remove bush rocks from landscapes at a really alarming rate. These soil amelioration practices are having untold impacts on vulnerable reptile species. Bushrock has been historically cleared and continues to be lost from large areas of agricultural landscapes. It is therefore critical to quantify how important these rocks are for the persistence of fauna so that the impact of such removal is known and appropriate legislative instruments and restoration programs can be developed. Now, there is some preliminary evidence to suggest that restoring bushrock may improve conservation outcomes for reptiles, and it's proposed as a key restoration measure, but it's really unclear how beneficial adding rock is, and nor has this rock restoration been tested on a large scale or in agricultural landscapes where this rock is often cleared. So to address major current knowledge gaps and build on preliminary studies, we experimentally quantified the potential and importance of bush rocks to be a useful restoration tool in agricultural landscapes. And this is our experimental design. So we employed a before-after control impact design, or a BACI design, to compare the effect of rock addition and also grazing treatments on measures of reptile diversity and abundance. We use a 2x2 factorial design, and we replicated this design across 10 sites around the Cowra area in New South Wales. So we kind of stretch from Goolagong, Cowra, Burrawa, and also Wyangla. So quite a range of areas. And we have 2 treatment levels. So there's 2 levels of grazing, so total exclusion grazing, and also business as usual grazing, which in this case is rotational grazing in these farms. And then we also have 2 levels of rocks. So we have control rocks, which are just natural rock levels, which most of the time there was no rocks, and the addition of rocks at a density of 4 rocks per metre squared, which equates to a density coverage of approximately 20%. We had 4 10x10 plots established at each site, and treatment plots that excluded stock grazing had a buffer, so they were 12.5 by 12.5 to control for edge effects. So far we've completed 5 surveys, including 3 before surveys in 2019 and 2 post-treatment surveys in spring and summer of 2020. We've added approximately 50 tonne of rock, which was a lot of fun to drag this around all the farms in Cowra. And we added approximately 1 kilometre of grazing exclusion fencing, which is pictured in those 2 pictures there. And we have 2 post-treatment surveys remaining, and these surveys are critical as the landscape changed remarkably between 2019 and 2020. So the surveys this year will help to provide more evidence for our preliminary findings and help us understand colonisation dynamics. So far, we have found that added rock was colonised within 3 months of addition, and pink-tailed worm lizards were the most common species found under rock, but not in traps. We also found that the eastern striped skink and rainbow skinks were the most commonly captured species in pitfall and funnel traps in rock plots. And rock addition plots had a greater diversity of both frog and reptile species captured compared to non-rock plots. The added rocks are definitely having a positive effect on not just pink-tailed worm lizards, but also early colonisers such as the eastern striped skink and the olive delma. And the olive delma is pictured there, but not the eastern striped skink. The impact of grazing exclusion is unclear at this stage due to both the timing of treatment additions, because these weren't added until mid last year due to some issues with COVID and drought and other things, and the vastly different environmental conditions of 2019 and 2020. So it's not quite clear yet if the fences are having an impact, but it's likely that this impact will be more clear in the surveys conducted this year. The key outcomes of this project is to first quantify the use and importance of bushrock for reptiles, particularly for threatened species such as the pink-tailed worm lizard. And we hope by quantifying this use and importance that there will be greater consideration given to conserving large areas of bushrock on farms, rather than only considering native vegetated areas, which may not always lead to significant conservation outcomes for reptile species that usually select habitat based on structural complexity. And we hope we hope to determine if bushrock can be restored and have conservation outcomes for reptiles, to therefore provide tangible management outcomes for restoration activities undertaken by Landcare and under community groups, and decisions around biodiversity offsets for landholders and managers. On a larger scale, the project findings will have broad application value, and we also aim to change the policy around the clearing of bushrock as part of routine agricultural activities in New South Wales. So far, the preliminary results of this study are really encouraging, and the final results of the experiment will be known by early next year. Thank you for listening, and please get in contact and stay tuned for further outcomes of this project.